Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the final talk of this year's Relevant series titled, Where Do We Find Meaning in Life? A conversation between an atheist and a Christian. My name is Jocelyn, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to moderate our panel this evening. I'm currently a third-year student at the University of Toronto, studying criminology as my first major and industrial relations and human resources as my second major. A little bit of an overview of this evening before we begin. I'm just going to go over a few quick items with us, and then we're going to begin with a time of dialogue with our speakers. Afterwards, we are going to have an opportunity for a Q&A, and I'm going to give further instructions about that later. I'm going to start things off with a land acknowledgement. So it is our duty as Christians to love indiscriminately as Christ did so for us. As such, we believe that God created all people groups and all land, including the land occupied by the University of Toronto and McGill University. The land used by the University of Toronto was once occupied by the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River for thousands of years. Today, many Indigenous groups from all across Turtle Island still call this place home. The Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe likewise settled the land where McGill now sits. We are thankful for the opportunities we have on this land to work and learn here. A few housekeeping items before we get started. If you have any accessibility needs whatsoever, we're going to do our absolute best to accommodate you. Please email us at relevant2021@gmail.com with those accessibility needs. And then some ground rules before we get started. Don't be afraid throughout this evening to ask challenging or uncomfortable questions, but please try to just be respectful when doing so and refrain from using inappropriate language. I'm going to begin now by introducing our speakers. The first speaker is Julian Mussolino, who is a cognitive scientist, public speaker, and author who holds a dual appointment in the psychology department at Rutgers University and the Rutgers Center for Cognitive Science. Julian is also a member of the graduate faculty in the world-renowned Department of Philosophy at Rutgers. Julian's research spans a broad range of topics in the sciences of the mind, with the overarching goal of shedding light on what makes our intelligence distinctively human. Research topics include questions about language, rationality, agency, memory, and belief formation or updating. Julian's research has been published in leading scientific journals, and it has been funded by the National Institute of Health and the National Science Foundation. Julian's work also takes a public dimension and explores the implications of cognitive science for a range of issues of broader societal importance. The goal of this work is to promote the role, understanding, and importance of science, reason, and critical thinking. Secondly is Dan McDonald. Dan McDonald left his law practice in 1990 to pursue a call to full-time ministry. He currently serves as the senior pastor for Grace Toronto Church, which he started with his wife in 2005. Grace Toronto has planted 2 congregations over the past 5 years and has seen 3 of its interns go on to plant churches in Toronto and Ottawa. Dan served as the director of the Grace Network for 4 years until 2017, and he currently sits on the National Council of the Gospel Coalition Canada. Dan loves Jesus, and he also loves college football, fountain pens, Lord of the Rings, and Italian espresso. Dan has been married to Sue for 22 years, and they have a beautiful young daughter, Shayla, who is teaching them more about love, grace, drama, and the gospel than they ever wanted to know. We are so grateful to have both of them with us here tonight. Before we get started with our dialogue, I'm just going to go over some instructions for the Q&A. So at the end of tonight's formal panel, we're going to have the opportunity to engage further with our panelists by asking them questions. So if you have questions throughout the conversation tonight, please feel free to submit them to the link that's going to be posted in the chat at slido.com using the code #relevant. Feel free to also look through the questions that are being posted and upvote them if that's a question that you would like answered as well. And just note that all questions are anonymous. All right, so we are going to get started tonight with our first questions. So welcome, Julian and Dan. It's so good to be with you guys tonight. I'm going to get us started with a broader question for both of our panelists. The question is, where do you find meaning in life? And Julian, I'm wondering if you could start things off for us with this question.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the lovely introduction. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you, albeit virtually. I wish we could be doing this in person. I'm going to share my slides now. I prepared some slides to make some remarks. So let's turn to that. And I hope this is working well. And by the way, the organization is superb so far. So I'm really impressed by what you've been able to accomplish. Again, welcome, thank you. And I'm delighted to be with you. I wish I could say it's the first time I've been asked to talk about the meaning of life in 10 minutes, but it isn't. I've been asked to do that before, and I'm happy to do it again. So what I'd like to do in these brief remarks is clarify a few points that I think are important when we have such a discussion. And in doing so, I'm going to try to show you that there need not be any tension between a Christian and a naturalistic, non-theistic, if you prefer, worldview when it comes to questions of purpose and meaning. So in other words, you'll see that we're all in the same boat, which is really nice. And to do that, I'm going to rely on an analogy to sort of introduce some important ideas. So suppose we take a mundane artifact like a hammer and ask the following question: what is the purpose of a hammer and where does that purpose come from? Well, the answer is trivial in this case. The purpose of the hammer is to drive in nails, occasionally pull them out. And if we ask about where that purpose comes from, the answer is trivial as well. The purpose of the hammer comes from the mind of its creator. In this case, us people. We create and design artifacts to fulfill certain roles and functions, which explains in part why hammers look the way they do. Suppose now we turn to something that is called a natural object, like something like a snowflake, and ask the same question: what is the purpose of a snowflake? Well, here many people would say that the question is nonsensical, that there's no purpose to a snowflake because snowflakes are the product of blind physical laws, which are understood, and therefore there's no purpose leading to its emergence. So let's take this analogy now and apply it to, or transpose it to the two worldviews that are in the background. After all, it's a conversation between an atheist and a Christian. So let's begin with theism. If you're a Christian, I'm assuming you're a theist. Otherwise, you should check your belief system. According to theism, creative forces, so a particular god or gods in general, do have plans, goals, intentions, foresight, and purpose. On the other hand, naturalism, which is the view that most working scientists like myself espouse, on this view, creative forces, also known as the laws of nature, the laws of physics, the laws of chemistry, the laws of biology, these laws have no plans or goals or intentions or foresight or purpose. If I drop my glass of water on my desk and spill water all over the keyboard, gravity doesn't care. It just does what it does. So now these two views seem to create some tension, at least on the surface. And the tension between the two is often expressed in popular circles, at least, in the following form. The idea goes something like this: if naturalism is true, and the forces that created the universe, life, and human beings have no goal or purpose, and therefore no meaning, we're then asked, how can life itself have purpose or meaning? And this tension has been exploited. I'm not saying for good or bad, I'm just saying it's been exploited by leading Christian voices, as I'm sure you're aware. So here's, for example, a quote from Rick Warren, who tells us that without God, life has no purpose, and without purpose, life has no meaning. Without meaning, life has no significance or hope. This is Joel Osteen, another famous Christian voice. God is in control, and he has a great plan and purpose for your life. And of course, I have to quote William Lane Craig too. Thus, if there is no God, then life itself becomes meaningless. And another quote by Craig: if God does not exist, then you're just a miscarriage of nature, thrust into a purposeless universe to live a purposeless life. All we're left with is despair. I think these views are overly pessimistic and need not be that pessimistic. And the good news, I think, is that this apparent tension between naturalism and theism is in fact a big herring, a big red herring, meaning that it's illusory. So in other words, I think that the tension between theism and naturalism over questions of purpose and meaning, I'm not saying there's no tension at all between the two views, but at least in that domain, that tension is mostly illusory. Because even if naturalism is true, which I personally think there are very good reasons to believe, and there is therefore no meaning or purpose of life in the sense that the forces that give rise to living organisms are blind and don't have a purpose. This does not mean that there is no meaning or purpose in life. And here that semantic distinction between these two prepositions is crucial. And I'm going to say a bit more about what I mean. I hope it's a truism that things like love, family, friendship, the arts, sports, science, the occasional backache, helping others, striving to make the world a better place, et cetera, do in fact bring purpose. They can and they do bring purpose and meaning to both theists and non-theists, regardless of whether theism or naturalism is true. Now, I would add that to somehow insist, as some people do, that there be some cosmic purpose to life in order for there to be meaning and purpose in life strikes me as absolutely unnecessary, both intellectually and practically. So another way to say this is, suppose you ask, does life have meaning outside of human minds? In other words, are the forces that create life meaningful in the sense that they have plans, purposes, and so on and so forth? Our best understanding of the world suggests that the answer is no. But I would add, who cares? The really important question is the following: is there meaning in life for human minds? And the answer is trivial. Yes, of course there is. And that's really all we need. So I think there's a number of important and good things follow from this. Well, first, a question: if there is no purpose or meaning of life, again, in the sense that the forces that give rise to life are purposeless, but there is purpose and meaning in life because of love, of friendship, and so on and so forth, then where do purpose and meaning come from? Again, I think the answer is not mysterious. Purpose and meaning come from creatures that have certain kinds of minds. Certainly human beings and possibly other animals, although we don't know for sure. This means that if purpose and meaning are properties of the human mind, then they can be studied empirically, just like any other aspect of the mind. And in fact, that's what I happen to do for a living. And this means that naturalism, through scientific inquiry, in this case, cognitive science, psychology, sociology, neuroscience, can help us better understand purpose and meaning. And one would hope, with that improved understanding, provide a basis for human flourishing. So, see, I'm good with time now. I want to wrap up and give you a take-home message. Now, I hope you understand why I picked this lovely picture with a really gorgeous ambiguity. Mom, what is the meaning of life? You are. You are in the sense of you are to me, and you are your own meaning, the source of your own meaning. This is beautiful. So I want to end with a quote from a very wise person who said the following: life may be without meaning, but it really doesn't matter because you bring the meaning to it. Purpose and meaning are inherently yours because you're free to create them for yourself. Who said that? I did, just here and now. So if you're interested in the work that we do in my lab at Rutgers, you can visit it there. You can also visit my personal website. Of course, I'm on social media, just on Twitter. And you're welcome to read the popular book that I wrote a few years ago. There'll be more to come. Thank you so much, and I look forward to a wonderful discussion tonight.
Thank you so much, Julian, for just taking us through your worldview a little bit in the time we had, and where you find meaning in life. I'm going to direct this question to Dan now to answer where he finds meaning in life.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Julian. I feel a little bit like someone who paid a lot of money as a fan of the USC to go watch a UFC match with Conor McGregor and then found out halfway through the night that I'm Conor McGregor's opponent. I just was amazed that you were able to pull that off in like 10 minutes. I'm a preacher. I can't say anything in under 30, but I am going to try. So I have also got something to share with you, and we're gonna just go here, and we're gonna start sharing the screen. I wanna just say, I would thank Julian for the mutual respect that he has given me this whole time. It has been wonderful. I agree with Julian that there is a question of testability that is at the heart of our discussion and our disagreement. And I think that God or no God, you can have subjective meaning, the kind of meaning that he described. But I think there are several meanings of the word meaning, and that's a little bit of what I want to get into now. Right now, we are at a kind of crossroads in history. There is a change in meaning going on in the cultural narrative. Charles Taylor, in A Secular Age, described the two options: the poetic, which is a subjective self-created meaning, which my esteemed colleague has just defended, versus mimetic, an objective kind of meaning, capital M meaning, larger meaning, the meaning of life he said we don't need. And these two have been battling it out. And Charles Taylor said that right now, the subjective self-created meaning has won. This is his definition of where we're at in our present moment. Everyone has the right to develop their own form of life, grounded in their own sense of what is really important or of value. No one else can or should try to dictate its content. I think that's pretty good. I think a fellow biologist and fellow atheist, someone that I think my colleague knows, Jerry Coyne, said it perhaps even better. I'm going to have to remove my screen because you're blocking my own. Okay. Cosmology does not give us one iota of evidence for purpose or for God. I can't even read it because my screen is being blocked by these people. Can you see that, Jocelyn? Can you read that for me?
Absolutely, I can read that for you.
Can you all see that? Secularists see a universe without apparent purpose and realize that we must forge our own purposes and ethics. But although the universe is purposeless, our lives aren't. We make our own purposes and they're real. I think that's a fair description of our social imaginary, the dominant narrative of our time right now. I'm going to see if that makes it any better, and I'll see if I can go here. But I want to say that this idea that we just need our own meaning, our own privately self-created meaning, has some questions that I want to pose to it, and I want to pose it today. And that is, does that description of meaning actually describe and explain reality as we experience it as human beings? Does it have explanatory power? Can people live it out consistently? Does it have power for human flourishing on an individual level? Does it satisfy our need for flourishing socially? Does it have the kind of power that I think Julian says it does for social interaction and flourishing? And finally, the big one, is it true that self-created meaning is sufficient? And so what I want to say is, I think when you ask these questions, I find that it doesn't answer them as well as my colleague thinks it does. Firstly, does it explain reality as we experience it? Well, I have a whole bunch of slides. I'll take too long, so I'll just kind of summarize what I had in those slides. And that is, firstly, there's a bunch of data here that is part of the reality of human existence and human experience that just isn't being dealt with by this simple, let's just create our own meaning. And one is, there's a massive worldwide prevalence of belief in actual mimetic, transcendent, objective meaning. Rodney Stark, who's been studying this using Gallup polls of all of the nations of the world, has this quote: "The overwhelming majority of people on Earth do think about the meaning and purpose of life." China may be the lowest, but even there, over half the population say they think about the meaning and purpose of life. Nearly everywhere else, almost 3/4 of the populations do so. And he gives some examples in his charts. 78% of Americans, 82% of Canadians, we beat the Americans on something. 79% of Finns, 74% of the British, 88% of the Italian, 56% of Indians, and just over 50% of the Chinese think there is a transcendent, objective purpose of life. We think that way. Why is it that we think that way? Secondly, there's a worldwide upswing in religious belief going on, despite the narrative that we hear all the time that the world is getting more secular. Pockets of the developed world are getting more secular, and I would put Canada and probably the United States as two of them. But the general data is that the world, while it's getting more educated and affluent, is getting more religious. Well over 80% of the world now believe in one of the 5 major religions of the world. Now, that's just some data, but as Rodney Stark put out in the same book, The Triumph of Faith, what does the data tell us? Quite simply, that a massive religious awakening is taking place. So I want to say there's data here that makes us wonder about, is it really as satisfying as Julian says? And in fact, there is a almost universal and worldwide longing for objective, mimetic, transcendent meaning, not just subjective meaning. And so I think what we need to do is say to ourselves, the reality that we see is that the vast majority of people think that there's a larger meaning in life, and they want there to be one. Given the idea of naturalism, that their life just came from uncaused events and random acts within naturalistic history, I wonder where that comes from. I don't know that it explains the model completely enough. We don't seem to think so. And secondly, can people live it out consistently? Here's our man for the moment, Jerry Coyne. Jerry Coyne's a very famous biologist, very famous atheistic biologist and speaker. And Jerry Coyne himself says, and he says it fairly clearly, that he is an activist. He is a social activist. He's a strong activist. He protested against apartheid. He got arrested. I protested against apartheid. I didn't get arrested, but I understand his convictions. Jerry is a fierce follower and fierce defender of free speech. And he says free speech ought to be defended everywhere. He said, I don't know anyone who I would not invite to a university setting to speak. I wouldn't disinvite a racist. I wouldn't disinvite a white supremacist. I just think it's too odious against free speech. Jerry Coyne is acting as if free speech is an absolute value. And so one of the things that we see almost all the time is what I think Terry Eagleton points out in his book, The Meaning of Life, and that is no one actually lives this way. We all, with the things that we choose, the things that we value, the things that we protest for, we tend to create, and we, as what Terry Eagleton says, we smuggle an absolute in. So we can't live it out consistently. Does it satisfy socially? Does it give social flourishing a great opportunity? Here's where in my world of political theory, I find the most difficulty with this idea, and that is, if you believe that all meaning is created by the self, then your own meaning has no normative power over anybody else. And so there is no shared platform of meaning or value within which you can argue, as Martin Luther King Jr. did, that all of us are created equal, black or white. You don't have the ability, because the response back is, well, I'm creating my own meaning, and in my own meaning, they're not equal. And so it has been fairly clearly proven that this kind of rise of self-created meaning, while it does have subjective power to give you a sense of meaning, in terms of social justice, in terms of searches for truth, it takes away any shared platform that anybody can appeal to. And so it really is subversive of social justice in the long run. I was talking to a PhD student at Queen's University in political theory and asking her about this, and she said, that's why actually in our department, we have moved beyond postmodern and self-created definitions of meaning, value, and truth, because they simply take out from you the ability to argue for social justice. And so finally, I'm going to ask the question, is it true? I don't know that it is true that that meaning is enough. When so many people want deeper meaning, when self-assigned meaning really struggles to make us flourish socially because it gives us no power to really argue for social justice. And when people cannot live it out consistently in their own lives, I say, it may or may not be true. But the answer to whether it's true or not really gets into the answer of whether God exists or not. And that's where I want to move to my next few points. Meaning as the gospel sees it. This is the Christian view. I'm going to define it, quickly examine it, and then we'll be done. Christian meaning, we're created in the image of God. There's no greater meaning than I know of than the meaning given by the Christian faith to humanity. It says you were not just made as a human being, not just a collection of atoms, but you were assigned divine dignity. You were made in God's image to be beautiful, to have a specific purpose. You were made to be stewards of the environment. You were made with moral responsibility, covenantal responsibility with God. There is no greater dignity that I know of than the meaning that Christianity gives to humanity. But it goes deeper than that. Christianity also says that we fell from this deeply covenantal and intimate relationship with God, and it created autonomy and alienation. And so in this Christian understanding of meaning, we have both this desire for greatness that gives language to and validity to our desire for ultimate meaning, but also explains why we find so much meaninglessness. Because what I think Julian's going to say, and I think he's absolutely right, there's all kinds of meaninglessness in the world. There's all kinds of brokenness in the world. There's all kinds of brokenness even in the natural world, in a sense that it doesn't always seem to lead to human flourishing. There's earthquakes, there's fire, there, etc. And I agree with them. But the Christian doctrine of the fall says that all of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. It also says that the creation itself is groaning, waiting for its redemption. That this affects all of us, that there is this combination of beautiful dignity, but also real brokenness. This combination of longing for more, but having to live with less. And I think that paradox of human existence that we see all around us, data, empirically, is better explained by this idea of creation and fall. And finally, of course, as a Christian, I want to say there's no greater meaning, no more beautiful meaning than the idea of being redeemed by a God who became a human being himself. And so I want to say that Jesus came into the world as a human being. God became a human. Does that not dignify and give meaning to all of humanity, that God himself would deem us worthy to become human with us? Unbelievable. And of course, he didn't just live with us. He died for us. He died to break the alienation. He died to remove the autonomy. It says that Jesus Christ became a curse for us. God made him who knew no sin to be sin for us. So the beautiful thing is God loves us, cares enough for us that he's willing to become one of us and even die for us. And so I would say that the Christian story assigns such beautiful meaning. Now, of course, the final question is it true? Is it true? And I want to say, Jesus rose from the dead. That's the beautiful part about history. One of the things I love about Julian is his incredible grasp of empirical-based methodology for finding truth. But we have to admit that it isn't just scientific empiricism that gives us truth, it's also history. And the historical record tells us that there was one man who came, claimed to be God, did some miracles, died. And then 3 days later, the tomb was empty. The Roman guards couldn't find his body. The Jewish authorities couldn't find his body. His disciples who had run away in fear were suddenly transformed into saying they were his witnesses. They'd seen him alive. No one could find the body to disprove it. More and more people started seeing him. And then someone who was part of the elite that was persecuting Jesus, Paul, who was totally invested in his arrest and the persecution of Christians, a hostile witness, himself ran into the risen Jesus on the road and had all of his presuppositions battered and blown up because of the truth of a historical event. And so I say that if the resurrection is true, there is such deep and beautiful meaning that the Christian gospel gives, not only to our lives, but to each other. Thanks. I'm done.
Thank you so much, Dan, for just taking us through your worldview as well as proposing those questions that people ask. And as we head into a time of dialogue between Julian and Dan, we're going to continue asking some of those questions. So I'd like to start us off by posing another question to the both of you. As we reflect on the meaning of life and as we consider and reflect on the different worldviews which have been shared with us, I'd like to look at the topic of morality. So throughout history, people have always had moral intuitions which they felt compelled to uphold. Where do you think that this moral sense originates, and how do we determine right and wrong? So Julian, maybe I could ask you to start us off with that question, and then I'll ask Dan to provide an answer, and we can just interact with the question.
Sure, thank you. You can hear me, right? Yes? Okay, wonderful. So let's take the first question. Where do I think that the moral sense comes from? Well, you won't be surprised to hear that I think that the moral sense is a property of the human mind with precursors in non-human animals, and that it's a property of an evolved mind. So it comes from the evolution of our species. And there's a large body of scholarship now in the sciences under the umbrella of what is called moral cognition that looks into that moral mind and tries to shed light on its origins, its nature, its scope, its limits. As for the second question, how do we tell right from wrong? That's a very interesting question, but there are two questions really in that question. The first is a descriptive question, which is to say, when you look at what people actually do, how do they tell right from wrong? And that's an empirical question, and that's quite measurable. You can just observe what people do in naturalistic settings or in experiments, and you can say, look, here's what they do to decide right from wrong. And then there's a prescriptive question, which is, what kinds of ethical systems should we build? And there, the answer is we do it differently. And I think the way to do that is to use a universal currency, simply because we're not all Christians. If we use solely, let's say, Christian principles, then we exclude the non-Christians, the Jews and the Muslims and everything. If the principles are common to all religions, then that's fine. But otherwise, we use reason. Arguments, and we try to convince each other that certain practices and certain rules are better than others. And that's how it ought to work. Are you speechless, or should I expand?
No, you're good.
No? Okay, good.
Yeah, sorry, Joss, I'm waiting for you to chat.
Yeah, thank you, Julian, for sharing that with us, especially this idea of universal currency. I think that's really interesting and something we can delve further into. Dan, I want to invite you to interact with this question as well.
We get our moral intuitions by virtue of being human. I have very little differences with Julian in some of his discussions. He calls it, the property of an evolved mind. There's definitely been some evolution going on. Most Christians agree in microevolution. We don't have any problem with certain definitions of evolved. I think he has a larger definition of it, but I think that it is the property of the human mind. We create our moral intuitions from our mind. We also create them, I believe, from that part of us which is made in the image of God. And so it is part of our DNA to think morally. It is part of our DNA to think aesthetically. It's part of our DNA to have great amounts of self-reflection. And all of these things are part of humanity as we have been designed, as we are. And so whether you think we're designed by the naturalistic forces of evolution or designed by God's creation, I think we've come to a fairly similar answer where we probably just differ on how we got here.
We certainly do.
Interesting. And I think Julian shed some light on how he got there. But perhaps, Julian, you would be interested in sharing a little bit more about that. And Dan, would you be interested in sharing more on that as well in terms of this, how we got here?
How humans got here?
Yeah, yes. By how we got here, you mean how I got to my position or how we as a species got to where we are?
How you got to your imposition, but if the species question flows into that, then please expand that too.
Sure. Well, I mean, I am a member of the academic and the scientific community, and I am someone who studies professionally these questions. And if you look at the voluminous scientific literature on those questions, there's no place for design from God or anything like that. So basically, I come to these conclusions because it's reason and evidence that lead me to them. The evidence for the fact that evolution happened as in the course of history, I mean, writ large, is overwhelming. It's, I think, proper to call it a fact now. So the fact that species are not immutable. And then, of course, there's a mechanism that was proposed, natural selection. Not the only mechanism. There are other things that can happen, but I believe in that, again, because the evidence is overwhelming. And there is no need to invoke any kind of creator. And in fact, invoking such a creator has no explanatory power. And so virtually nobody in the sciences does that. There's no published scientific work that invokes any of this. So that's how and being in those circles, you can imagine that these are the conclusions that we have reached. Now, I fully understand, I'm aware that other people outside those circles have a different view, but what I would say is the following. I would invite them, if they want to make claims about, say, human biology, for example, or human psychology, I think they're in the wrong business. I think they should become psychologists or biologists. Again, to professional psychologists or biologists, there's no need to involve or to invoke any kind of supernatural creator. And therefore, I dispense with the assumption.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for expanding on that for us a little bit more. Dan, before we continue to move forward with our dialogue, would you like to add anything or interact with that at all?
Yeah, actually, you've given me an opportunity to share a little bit more of what I prepared. I way over prepared. I'll admit that to you right now. But I want to show you a picture, and hopefully you can see this goofy picture of me. Can you see this goofy picture of me, Julian? Can you see this picture of me with the straw too high for me that I can't even drink it? Yeah.
I envy the drink that you're having there. Yes.
Yeah, it's a wonderful drink that I'm having, and I'm wearing a vest that has been the source of much mocking in my professional career, Julian, because for reasons that escape everyone, including myself, I liked vests and I started wearing them all the time. But this picture is, to me, a marker of something, and that's what I want to talk about. How did I get where I got to? Was when I was in law school, I was an agnostic, functionally atheistic, but not learned enough to call myself an atheist. I came from the humanities side of things. But I encountered a bunch of Christians, and they slowly started to give me the historical evidence for Christ, but I also saw the evidence, and I call it evidence, real evidence of transformed lives. And so both the fact of the transformation in their life and the historical evidence for Christ really began to weigh on me. And at the end of my first year of law school, I actually realized that the evidence that compelled me that Jesus actually rose from the dead. And it's not empirical scientific evidence like you're talking about, Julian. It's not the kind of evidence you study. It's not the kind of evidence you think you need. But as a person with a minor in history from undergrad, I had a great deal of respect for the fact that historical events convey truth. The history, as it were, of Darwin's trip and what he learned on the Galapagos Islands is actually crucial to the story of the rise of evolution. And so I think you and I will both agree that history can contain truth. But what happened to me in that first year of law school was that I became a Christian. I prayed to receive Jesus. I thought I was being an idiot. I thought I was losing my mind. But actually what I was doing was I was gaining freedom. Because what you see in the picture here is someone allowing himself to be completely mocked in a variety of ways by his friends, who then put it up on social media. I went into seminary convinced that I was an intellectual rationalist, but bound emotionally, bound by the need to be respected. I wouldn't let anyone mock or humiliate me, family of origin stuff, etc. This picture is a transformed me. Am I a sinner and a hypocrite? Absolutely. The gospel tells me I will be. But can I allow people to mock me like this on social media? Something has happened in my life that is too real to be discarded. And so I would say that in the data of my empirical examination of my life and the things that used to bind me, sexual addictions, addictions to reputation, etc., that story of personal transformation is real data that really did change me, and real data that is why I am where I am. And so, yeah, I think that it's not just and I want to say this to Julian, it's not just the empirical evidence that we look at. I want to look at a more holistic view of data. And in that sort of situation, I don't necessarily agree with him that you don't need to look at historical truth or anything like that to form your worldview. To do your particular work as a psychologist or a neurologist, I completely agree with him. You probably don't need it. I completely understand it. But to live the kind of life of flourishing and meaning that I know Julian is after, and I know he encourages, and I think his work and his teaching encourage, and his book has encouraged in me. When you're asking the question of human flourishing, you're asking a much broader, more holistic question. And it's in those areas that I think absolutely these other questions, these other data points, these other kinds of ways of looking at life do become very relevant to us. And I think the data proves that they're relevant to a lot of us.
Yeah, I'm not denying that they're relevant, but they are empirical points of data. So empirical is all-encompassing. Reported subjective experiences are empirical points of data. So to take the example that you mentioned, you said that experience was too real to me to be dismissed. I don't doubt your sincerity, but let me give you an example. I had a very vivid dream last night that there was a monster under my bed. It was as real as anything you can imagine. I was sweating and so on and so forth. I don't want to conclude from that subjective experience that there really is a monster under my bed. So how we feel about something, however real it is not an indication of how true it is. It's an indication of how powerful the experience is, how sincere we are. And I don't for a second doubt your sincerity. That's wonderful, but we have to be careful when we claim that I feel it very deeply, therefore it must exist outside of me. No, it need not exist outside of people. Now, if it brings people meaning, that's wonderful. That's great. And back to the question about what you took to be the shortcomings of the naturalistic view, there are people, arguably a minority in the world, because as you said, most people are religious, but there are people, including myself, for whom there is simply no need for any of that transcendence or whatever. And therefore it simply shows that it's possible for human beings to function that way. Now,
absolutely. And I want to affirm, like I said, I keep affirming almost everything you said. And you're like,
I'm going to turn you into an atheist by the end of the show, I'm telling you.
And what I want to say to you is actually, no, I think that we have in some ways more agreements, and yet there's room for us to land in very different places because we start from very different places. And this is an example. What you just said I thought was so intriguing and so true, that just because I had a real dream and it was very real to me subjectively, that doesn't mean it's true. And I want to say, absolutely, that's something that I want to hold on to. If that's all I'm saying, you're absolutely right. But I want to take that exact point that you made and put it back on this idea of self-created meaning, Julian. If you think in your own subjective experience that this is true and you have this powerful experience and you find it meaningful to you, the Julian of 2 minutes ago said that doesn't prove it's true, but the Julian at the beginning said that's enough. That's the dissonance that I feel that we should explore. And if you're going to put it back on me, I agree with you. When I first started having these subjective feelings of transformation, they didn't mean much. I had to wait for a while till I saw objective markers of real behavioral change, real attitudinal change, real psychological, psychotherapeutically data driven, empirically verifiable change in the way that I was reacting and the way I was behaving before even I, who was skeptical of my own conversion, could believe that something real had happened above and beyond some subjective experience. So I agree with you. I have to go beyond that to say there's some truth to it. And I think I have. And I would say, I want to make sure that the description of self-created meaning also needs to go beyond that, that it just subjectively fills a sense of meaning for me. I just don't think that's enough for me. And I don't think that's enough for self-created meaning as a general category.
I'm not sure I understand what you mean when you say, so again, of course, those things are experienced by you powerfully, vividly. And of course, in some sense, they are true for you in the sense that you do really experience them. There's no denying there, of course. But now the question is, what does one mean by true? Do those feelings and even the changes that you described, I have little doubt too that those experiences changed you and changed your behavior. Of course. All kinds of experiences change people's behavior for the better or for the worse. There's no denying there. But when we say, is it true, we can mean two things. One is, am I really truthful in reporting that I experience it? Probably yes. Second question, is it true in the sense that, does it mean that those feelings correspond to something out in the world, outside of my mind, that independently exists? That's what we question. That's the dream example, right? The fact that you vividly experience the monster doesn't mean that the monster exists outside of your own head and under your bed, and that's crucial. So nobody's denying in the sciences that it is true for people in the sense that they do really experience those things. That's what we study. Of course it's true. People are not lying when they're saying those things. It's true for them, it's meaningful for them, it changes them, no doubt about that. But that's a different question from concluding that therefore there must be some entity out there outside of my mind that does this and that. These are very separate, very different questions.
I'm going to jump in. Thank you guys for the discussion on this question. And Dan, I think you said something earlier that leads us into the next question. So I'm going to start with that, but want to emphasize as well that these are things we can come back to and continue to discuss during our question and answer time. So especially for the audience, keep sending in those questions for discussion. Dan, you said earlier that you're starting from different places. Yourself and Julian might be starting from different places. And from what I understand so far, but could be wrong, that you both have very different views about the origins of humanity. So with that comes the question, do you think that our origins have bearing on the value and meaning of our lives? And if so, how? And Dan, I'm wondering if you could start us off with this question.
Sure. I sort of wove it into my my presentation, so I feel like I'd be repeating that, and I took a few more minutes, so I'll try and be really brief. I do think that we were created in the image of God. I think we were created with incredible beauty, aesthetic value, moral sensibilities, and there's just this incredible dignity about human beings, and there's this incredible meaning that's inherent to who we are. And I feel like, excuse me, this inherent dignity is something that we possess. It's something that we sometimes acknowledge, sometimes we don't. And it's something that we strive for. And what I want to say is it makes all the difference in the world. I mean, when I was a fan of Martin Luther King Jr. growing up, and marched for some civil rights, and I loved his speeches, and he had a starting point, and that is we're all equal because we're all made in God's image. And I found those kinds of things not just emotionally satisfying, I do think they're true, because I think God exists. And how do I think God exists? Because somebody rose from the dead as a fact of history. I don't just start it because I feel like it. I had rejected any religion when I went to McGill University. I'd become anti-religious, quietly agnostic, and very skeptical about the existence of God. And so I don't have near, like I said, he's Conor McGregor, I'm the fan. What he's about to say is going to give you much more of an empirical evidence for evolution. And I'm not here to even try and go up against you, Julia. And I think that, and I honor all of your, research and all of your study, but I don't think it disproves God. I don't. I think God has revealed himself in Jesus in history, but what Jesus says about God is he generally is an immaterial being. It's just not measurable by those kind of quantum footprints that we find when we study biology or study geology. And I'm okay with that. God has revealed himself in Christ. He's revealed himself sufficiently for me to believe in him as a fact of someone who's come in to be seen and tasted and touched. We're not just making something up as a presupposition that's mythological here. People who are very skeptical, like myself and the Apostle Paul, get their whole minds changed by the weight of the historical evidence. So I do think that God does exist, and I think because of it, and because of the record of us being created, there's incredible dignity, beauty, and glory, if I can use that word, in human anthropology. And so, sorry, Julian, I took more time than I thought I would.
That's perfectly fine. That's perfectly fine. I agree with you about the fact that we do have dignity and we do have value, and I just don't agree with you about where they come from. But otherwise, I agree on at least at the descriptive level.
Yeah.
There are a couple of things you said that kind of are striking to me. The first is you talk about historical evidence as though it was separate from scientific evidence. It's not. History is done through, broadly speaking, rational means. I mean, it's like detective work. In fact, we know, for example, that the dinosaurs existed. That's history, but we know through science, carbon dating and so on and so forth. So the two are not separate. They're the same, essentially. Likewise for cosmology. Cosmology is about history. Right? It's the history of the early universe. It's done through science, right? So now when you say that you're moved by the historical evidence of the resurrection, that must mean that you're moved by the scientific evidence of the resurrection. But to someone like me, resurrection means resurrection is a claim about biology, because if you ask biologists, they'll tell you, or medical doctors, they'll tell you once you're dead, that's it. So for me to be convinced by any kind of evidence, whether you want to call it historical or not, I'd have to, I'd have to see it. So that's why I think that's one point of disagreement. Then you said something else which I thought was interesting. You said, I don't think science can disprove God, but I'm not sure that's the right, well, first of all, I would disagree with that, but I would say I'm not sure that's the right question to ask because of this notion of burden of proof. If somebody makes a claim, a positive claim about existence, so let's say I want to claim that some entity exists, it's not up to somebody to disprove my claim, it's up to me to prove it.
Yes,
and if it's not proven, then the onus doesn't fall on me to disprove it. So I think where we disagree is, for me, I don't see any reason in history or anything like that to believe that. I don't doubt that Jesus probably existed. Okay, that's fine. But what I seriously doubt is that he rose from the dead, because it contradicts everything we know about physics and biology, and the laws of physics and biology that apply today also applied 2,000 years ago, or something like that. So to me, it's just completely implausible and improbable that that happened. Whatever the facts say, or whatever the historical, anyway, go ahead.
And again, I agree with almost everything you said. It is completely implausible. It's biologically implausible, it's scientifically implausible, whatever you want to call it. And I'm glad to hear you say history is just part of general body of truth that is testable. That was one of my starting points for rules of the road. And I just completely agree with you. The implausibility of the resurrection, I mean, if you're a Christian here and you think that the average skeptical, educated person should just buy into the resurrection, you're like, go have another beer. You're crazy.
So why do you buy into it then? I'm curious. Why do you buy into it?
Because of the way
if it flies into the face of biology and everything, why do you buy it?
Because every once in a while, something that flies into the face of what you normally think and understand based on a fairly well settled paradigm, something comes in and changes it. Changes the paradigm. And what I'm saying is, in Christian understandings, the gospel writers themselves said, look, the miracles Jesus did are signs. They're not meant to be They're not meant to be naturalistic, new norms of behavior. They're not setting up patterns that you're going to see. They're irregular eruptions into regularized, naturalized patterns of human and biological behavior of God to show that there is actually God. There is actually this other dimension. So the resurrection of Jesus is meant to say Jesus was God. It's meant to say something scandalous. And it's actually why he died. He claimed he was God. He claimed he would rise from the dead. And that's why they killed him. It was just so ridiculous to them and heretical that they killed him. But I would say that if the weight of the historical evidence is there, you've got to take a look at it. And that's what I did. I mean, I took 6 months to look at it, and I found all the evidence I could, and it convinced me. Should I have been skeptical? Yeah, you probably should be more skeptical because you know more and have more reasons to be skeptical than I do. But if he actually rose from the dead, he rose from the dead. If it's the only time in history, it's the only time in history. But the strikingly abnormal nature, the implausible nature of the resurrection is actually what the gospel wants to say. They don't want to say, oh, this is an entirely reasonable thing you should believe in. You should be mad, scandalized, shocked, think it's completely implausible. You should. But if it happened, it happened. So I think we're really close in those ways. We just agree to disagree as to whether it happened. But in this area, I may have actually done more study than you have. This is probably the only area tonight that will have happened, but it may actually be.
No, for sure. I don't doubt it for a second. However, I doubt that there's any amount of reading one can do that would contravene the entire laws of physics and biology. But I don't doubt for a second that you know more about the history than I do.
Can I ask you a question about that,
Sure.
Julian? Because I get this a lot. I had a guy who a PhD in biology say exactly the same thing to me. So I just want to ask you,
Sure.
If you start off with an agnostic view that God could exist or not exist, if you started there, and you don't, and I don't now, we start somewhere else. But if we could somehow start in that neutral position, that God could exist, would you say then it's logically possible, based on the existence of God, that he could intervene in the laws of nature he created and do miracles?
Oh, look, anything is possible. Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I'll give you a range of things that are even crazier than you can imagine. But the question is not what's possible. The question is, what is there evidence for?
Okay, so here's what I'm saying. If you looked at the evidence for the resurrection, not from this is almost impossible. I'm never going to believe it because all of what I have learned. But if you come at it with this, it's possible God exists, and then you look at the evidence, it might change the way you interpret the evidence. Because the lens through which we look at everything, as you know, often determines how we interpret the facts we're seeing. That's part of the problem that Einstein had, as far as I understand from the PhD in physics that I was talking to. He said they were just looking at the evidence in ways that he wasn't. And until they took the lens off, was the physics community able to begin to understand, his theories of relativity. I'm not a physicist, but that's what a PhD was telling me. I think it's that lens through which we look at. Go.
Yeah, but Einstein was playing a very different game. He was not invoking magic in his explanations. That's very different. But
you see the language you just used?
What?
Magic.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, but I used that on purpose. Yeah. So
okay.
If you see, I'll give you an example. Suppose you go see David Copperfield, as I did like a decade or 2 decades ago at Indiana University. He does these wonderful magic tricks where girls disappear, tigers appear. Okay, suppose now you ask, how does he do it? And suppose somebody says, well, it's magic. Well, that doesn't explain anything. What I want to know is, where are the trapdoors? Where's the invisible thread? That's what an explanation is. Einstein was playing within the context of scientific, mechanistic, physical explanation, which I agree with you, does change. The facts on the ground, by the way, a lot of them don't change, right? The explanations change. But I see that our hostess is probably eager to move, right? 1 minute left. So
I just saw the time card, yeah.
Okay, is it now the part where we take questions from the audience?
It is that time. So first, thank you both for just sharing your insights, your thoughts, your worldview, pieces of who you are with us. We are going to move into a time of question and answer with the audience. You guys have already started bringing up some of your own great questions that you've been navigating. So I'm excited for this time for us to also engage with the audience. Before we do so, we're going to have a brief sidebar and talk about our follow-up form. So for the audience, for those of you who might be left with some of your own questions after this dialogue, or you want to just continue the conversation, we are going to have a follow-up form. It's going to be linked in the chat down below, and it gives us an opportunity to connect further. And what we are all going to do actually is, now that that link is posted there, we are going to click on it together, and we are going to go through the follow-up form together. So bear with me for those of you who might feel like this isn't something you're interested in. Please just humor me. We're going to quickly go through it. And as we're going through it, please feel free to just fill it out as we go. So the follow-up form pops up. The first question asks what campus you are from. So if you are a student, we would love to just know who's tuning in and where they're tuning in from to understand a little bit more of the diversity of our audience. If you are not a student, feel free to just type that in that line and let us know. No worries at all, but just a way for us to get to know our audience. The second option allows for us to just hear from you on which event you attended. So you're just going to click the drop down and click this event. For the third option, it asks how you heard about this event. This just lets us know effective ways of advertising, how people are finding out about our events coming out to them. Then it asks how well you think the event addressed the subject and how much you enjoyed the event or the talk. So please feel free to just choose an option there. And then it asks if you identify with a particular spirituality or religion. If so, which one? This again is just an opportunity for us to better understand where our audience is coming from, who's in our audience, and what their worldviews are. Then it asks what other topics you would be interested in exploring. This is just for us to know as we look ahead to future talks, future relevant series, and then an opportunity to leave any more comments or feedback. If you would like to connect with us further, that's what the rest of the form is for. If you would not like to connect with us further, that is totally fine. Please still take the time to just give us your feedback. For connecting further, it just takes you through the questions of how you'd like to connect, your name, your year of study if you are a student, your email so we can connect with you. And it also gives you an option to find out a bit more about Alpha. Alpha is a Christian series which takes us through faith-based questions. I'm going to expand on that a little bit later on. And that is the follow-up form. So please take some time to just fill that out, submit it. Hopefully you're already done by the time I'm finished talking. And without further ado, we're going to move back into the question and answer time. So thank you guys for bearing with me. As mentioned earlier, feel free to continue to submit your questions to Slido with the code #relevant. And if you would like to upvote any of the questions that you see there, just click that thumbs up button and it'll move it up so that we see it and we can pose the question. Our first question is for both panelists, and each of you can kind of speak to this individually. The question is there anything that would cause you to change your position or belief in regards to atheism or Christianity? And perhaps, Julian, I could ask you to start us off with that question.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a great question. The answer in general is that in the scientific community, an honest scientist will tell you that they're never sure 100% of anything. Yeah. We have degrees of belief in various things, but it's never one, meaning probability 1 or 0. And so, yes, in principle, of course, I'd be willing to change my mind on virtually anything you can imagine. In the case of the God or Christianity question, what I would first like to hear from whoever's trying to change my mind is a precise notion of what that God is supposed to be. And then what we would ask, what kind of evidence would one need to actually believe that such a thing exists? And we know a lot about this. So for example, I believe in invisible things that travel very fast through the air called electromagnetic waves. I've never seen them. Well, I do see them, obviously, right? Light. But I believe in them because there's a lot of evidence. In fact, I can push a button and call my friend in California. Okay, then I believe in invisible things like electromagnetic waves that people a few hundred years ago would have screened as magic. So we know what it means to have a level of evidence that's really, really strong. Now, if somebody can tell me, look, here's exactly what God is, and here's what he does or can do, and we'll look at the evidence. But I've never seen anything like that. So that's why I don't believe. But if, somebody makes a good case, then sure, I'm totally open.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yep.
Dan, I'd like to pose the question to you as well.
I would agree with almost everything he said, but just flip it. If you gave me good arguments, particularly in the issue of the resurrection that completely disproved it, I would definitely be open. I think, Julian, you're...
I'm worried now. What are you going to say about me?
No, that's what I love about you. And I know we don't know each other that well, but it's, I don't know how to say this exactly, but what I appreciate about Julian is what I hope and aspire to myself, which is serve the truth. If the truth is the truth, then I want to align to it. In that sense, we're all mimetic. I don't want to create meaning out of a lie. I want to create meaning that's in accord with reality. That is
Wonderful.
Actually
join the scientific community then. If you want to.
Well, that's what made me a Christian. So that's why I'm saying. That's why I'm saying. After this,
that's what we study. We study reality. That's what we do. I'm joking. I'm teasing you.
I know you're joking, and I know you're teasing, and I love that. Trash talking and teasing is my love language, as people who know me well know. But I do say almost everything except for my position to his position. Give me a good argument, prove it, knock out my foundations, and I would be willing to look at it. I know I'm 58 and I've spent my life in ministry, but truth is more important. I believe God exists. I believe God is the author of truth, and I'm honoring him by doing that. And so, yeah. And so I'm willing to do that. So
I'll give you a good argument.
I'm reading your book, so I'm actually getting one from you even when we don't chat, buddy.
I'm glad.
Fantastic. Thank you guys for that first answer. I think, a really interesting theme has been that in a lot of areas, you're coming from very similar places. So I'm excited to continue to explore some of the answers that you've come to. And that brings us into our next question for Julian. The question is, if we make our own meaning in life, does that mean it is acceptable to find meaning in things that are dangerous to ourselves and others?
Mm-hmm. Well, two comments about this, right? First, again, a descriptive answer. Is it the case that people find meaning in things that are dangerous to themselves or others? Quite probably. I can think of certain drugs that are very dangerous. I'm sure that some people find meaning in it. So that's a descriptive answer. Now, is it acceptable? Well, would we allow people to hurt other people? And no, of course not. But you don't need to be either a theist or a non-theist. You just need to be a sane person to realize that. And we have a body of laws that prevent, or at least that punish people who do that. So no, it's not acceptable, but for trivial reasons, So, yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yep.
This question is for Dan, so I'm just going to move us along because that's a nice flow. The question is, how can you be sure that this Christian meaning is not a meaning created by someone a few thousand years ago, which somehow spread across the world?
I think that's a great question. If you don't mind, I'm going to take a second to think how to answer it with a little more depth, because I think it really deserves, a good answer. Thank you for asking, whoever asked. I think at the end of the day, there's something very unusual about Christianity amongst most of the world religions that you have alluded to, and I don't know if you're trying to, that it's spread across the world. It's the largest religion. 2.2 billion people, I think, 33% of the total population. Most of the other world religions either grew in a geographic area simply by being kind of homegrown religions like Hinduism. Expanded quickly like Islam, but a lot of that was military conquest. Christianity is the one that spread into the most cultures and primarily by conversion. So there's something unique about Christianity, that it gets people out of their own invested worldviews, values, ways of seeing and living and understanding reality, and switches them completely over so that they feel like their people around them think, as Julian would say, you're believing in magic. But Christianity's had that resume. And why is that? I do think it's the evidence, the historical evidence, and I think, I've got to say it, God's power. I think God exists. God takes something that most people, I think, should scoff at, and I scoffed at for a long time. And then suddenly I wasn't scoffing anymore, because the people around me had such different lives, and it wasn't just psychological experiences. They were just radically different lives. There was a power in them that I couldn't quite deny. And I found that power operating in me after I became a Christian. And I've seen dozens and dozens of people come to faith around me for the same variety of reasons. So I think one friend of mine said, he thinks Christianity spread because it's true and it works. Christianity creates generally speaking, I'm not going to talk about 21st century Christianity in North America, because Julian and I can probably agree on that too. It's been a bit of an absolute disaster in many ways, but Christ himself and the power that he gives you to love people more selflessly and to serve people more joyfully is a radical data point that has convinced many people of its truth. And so I do think the transformative power of Christianity in the lives of people has been a primary carrier of this contagious virus of magic we call Christianity. People seeing lives changed is easily the number one reason historically and existentially that I hear from people today as to why they became interested in Christianity, and then looked at the evidence. They don't look at the evidence first, because to Julian's point, it's so implausible. It really is. They have to see something radically different in someone's life to go, wait a minute, you're operating on a different operating system. I'm curious now. I'm no longer completely skeptical. I'm curious. And that's, I think, the general pathway forward for how Christianity came to be where it is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you for your response, Dan. I'm going to ask the final question of our Q&A for this evening. It's for both Julian and for Dan. And the question is, everyone wants to hold on to hope when things get hard. What gives you hope in life? And Julian, if it's all right, can I ask you to start us off with that question?
Of course, yeah. I think if you look at the history of our species, we've made tremendous progress in all kinds of areas that are obvious, right? We don't have, I can pick a lot of horrible things that we used to do in the past that we don't do anymore. You can look at life expectancy that's gone up. You can look at poverty that's been reduced, and so on and so forth. Does the fact that we have made progress means that everything is perfect? Far from it. There's still a lot of work to be done, especially in the US. But we've made progress, and so we have the capacity to make progress. And there's no law of nature that says that we can't continue to make progress. And that gives me hope.
Do you want me to speak now, Jocelyn? Can you repeat the question? I'm struggling with an answer good enough for the question as I remember it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the question is, everyone wants to hold on to hope when things get hard. What gives you hope in life?
Gives me hope. At the risk of sounding incredibly tritely Christian, Jesus gives me hope. Because the story that Jesus gave us is his story, that we're going to die and that we're going to rise again. And there is going to be a day when not only will we see human progress, which I grant, again, Julian, there's been tremendous human progress, There'll be a day when that progress will end because we'll have reached perfection. There will be no more tears, and there will be no more pain, there will be no more disease, there will be no more death. That is the certain hope that the resurrection of Jesus proved was true and showed the way forward to it. It was both descriptive, as in that it described what would happen to us, and it was prescriptive in that it said, live with this hope. And so I live with that certain hope every day. It's the hope that I can spend my life trying to serve others in this strange way, leaving the practice of law to become a Christian minister, losing many of the perks of life that I might have gotten had I stayed in my chosen career path. But I could easily give those away because I had a certain hope from the resurrection of the dead that everything that I might be bypassing in my career choices, don't have to worry about that. One day, I will inherit far more than I could ever have asked or imagined. And every selfless, sacrificial thing I ever do, and I don't do much, but every little thing will be worth it because it will be more than made up for. So I find, and I find atheists tell me this when they hear the reality of the Christian story, they go, "It's too good to believe, but I got to admit, it's a pretty nice picture you paint." And I say to them, "Well, maybe it is true." And I know it is true, but Jocelyn, I have a certain hope because Jesus rose from the dead, and I will rise too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you to both Dan and Julian for your time tonight, for your insights, for being so willing to share with us your worldviews and what you believe. We really, really appreciate that. Thank you as well to the audience for coming out tonight. It has been so good to be with you all virtually. Although this isn't quite the space we might have preferred, it's been wonderful to spend this time together. As we close, we do have a few more brief announcements before we close things off. And the first announcement is about Alpha, which was touched on earlier. So I believe there's a video that will play, but before the video plays, I'm just going to introduce Alpha. So Alpha is a time where we can continue to have these conversations about things like what is the meaning of life, and we can engage with them through a time of discussion. It's an interactive series which engages people about the Christian faith. It includes time to connect, watch a video, to talk about, and to share thoughts and questions that you might have. We will be starting Alpha next week, the week of the 25th. And if you would like to get connected to Alpha, please fill out the follow-up form, which I believe is in the chat. Fantastic, there it is. And that's a way for you to get connected so we can keep exploring these questions together. I believe there's a short video that is going to play about Alpha now. And then that brings us into our final announcements for this evening. So this talk is the conclusion of our relevant talk, but if you are interested in looking at some of these topics that are up on the screen, if you missed the first few talks and want to engage with them and watch them, feel free to fill out that follow-up form. Let us know in your feedback section and we can send you the link to watch them on YouTube. We are going to be having a post-talk Zoom call. So for those of you who may still have questions that you want to ask, we are going to be meeting from 8:30 till 9 p.m. It's going to be non-webinar style, so more of an informal Zoom setting. And there's going to be staff and students from different campus groups there trying to answer your questions, as well as discuss and process the things that were brought up tonight. We might also have the opportunity to go over some Slido questions that weren't covered now. We'll see where the discussion takes us. So you can feel free to come out, whether you want to discuss or you want to listen and hear from others. It would be great to see you there. And the Zoom link is on this slide and I believe in the chat as well. So feel free to take a picture of that or copy and paste it now so you can join us later. Thanks again to Julian and Dan for joining us tonight. It's been so great to have this incredible conversation with the two of you and to hear from you and learn from you. And thank you to our audience as well for coming out tonight. It's been great to be with you all, and have a great rest of your evening.
Ah, the faces are appearing.
I'm seeing live human beings again.
Yes, I want to say thank you so much. This was really awesome to see your interaction and how courteous you guys are both to one another. It was beautiful. Thank you so much for doing that and just being so open and honest and the way you were sharing.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. I guess we just wanted to debrief before you guys head out. So yeah, how do you think the event went, or how do you, in terms of like the time, in terms of the questions and everything, just like overall, I guess, like how, yeah, your thoughts.
You want to start, Dan?
Go ahead, Julian.
I want to praise you for the way you ran this. It was really impressive in terms of the organization. Everything was clear, you know. Love the little chat room on the side. It was just fantastic. Jocelyn was great as an MC.